Chapter 10, Part 1 of Life of Henry David Thoreau by Henry Salt. The lack of system, which is noticeable in Thoreau's character, may be traced in the style of his writings as plainly as in his philosophical views. He was not careful as to the outer form and finish of his works, for he believed that the mere literary contour is of quite secondary importance in comparison with the inner animating spirit. Let the worthiness of the latter once be assured, and the former will fall naturally into its proper shape. Furthermore, although, as we have seen, writing was more and more recognized by him as his profession in his later years, he was at all times conscious of a fuller and higher calling than that of the literary man. As he valued nature before art, so he valued life before literature. He both preached and practiced a combination of literary work and manual, of the pen and of the spade, of the study and of the open sky. He protested against that tendency in our civilization which carries division of labor to such an extent that the student is deprived of healthy outdoor work, while the laborer is deprived of opportunity for self-culture. He imagines the case of some literary professor who sits in his library writing a treatise on the huckleberry, while hired huckleberry pickers and cooks are engaged in the task of preparing him a pudding of the berries. A book written under such conditions will be worthless. There will be none of the spirit of the huckleberry in it. I believe in a different kind of division of labor, and that the professor should divide himself between the library and the huckleberry field. His opinions on the subject of literary style are clearly stated in The Week, and are no doubt in great measure a record of his own practice. Can there be any greater reproach than an idle learning? Learn to split wood at least. The necessity of labor and conversation with many men and things to the scholar is rarely well remembered. Steady labor with the hands, which engrosses the attention also, is unquestionably the best method of removing palaver and sentimentality out of one's style, both of speaking and writing. If he has worked hard from morning till night, though he may have grieved that he could not be watching the train of his thoughts during that time, yet the few hasty lines which at evening record his day's experience will be more musical and true than his freest but idle fancy could have furnished. Surely the writer is to address a world of laborers, and such therefore must be his own discipline. He will not idly dance at his work who has wood to cut and cord before nightfall in the short days of winter, but every stroke will be husbanded and ring soberly through the wood, and so will the strokes of that scholar's pen, which at evening record the story of the day, ring soberly yet cheerily on the ear of the reader, long after the echoes of his axe have died away. Such were, in fact, the conditions under which Thoreau wrote many of the pages of the journal from which his own essays were constructed. And whatever may be thought of the force of his general principle, there can be no doubt that in his particular case the result was very felicitous. It was his pleasure and his determination that his writing should be redolent of the open-air scenery by which it was primarily inspired. "I trust," he says of the Week, and the same may be said of all his volumes, "it does not smell so much of the study and library, even of the poet's attic, as of the fields and woods." That it is a hypaethral or unroofed book, lying open under the ether and permeated by it, open to all weathers, not easy to be kept on a shelf. In this way Thoreau added a new flavor to literature by the unstudied freshness and wildness of his tone, and succeeded best where he made least effort to be successful. "It is only out of the fullness of thinking," says Mr. R. L. Stevenson, "that expression drops perfect like a ripe fruit." And when Thoreau wrote so nonchalantly at his desk, it was because he had been vigorously active during his walk. Even Mr. Lowell, a far less friendly critic, is compelled, on this point, to express his admiration. "With every exception, there is no writing comparable with Thoreau's in kind that is comparable with it in degree where it is best. His range was narrow, but to be a master is to be a master. There are sentences of his as perfect as anything in the language, and thoughts as clearly crystallized. His metaphors and images are always fresh from the soil." This success, although naturally and unconsciously attained, had of course been rendered possible in the first instance by an honest course of study. For Thoreau, like every other master of literary expression, had passed through his strict apprenticeship of intellectual labor. Though comparatively indifferent to modern languages, he was familiar with the best classical writers of Greece and Rome, and his style was partly formed on models drawn from one of the great eras in English literature, the post-Elizabethan period. It is a noticeable fact that mother tongue was a word which he loved to use even in his college days, and the homely native vigor of his own writings was largely due to the sympathetic industry with which he had labored in these quiet but fertile fields. Nor must it be supposed, because he did not elaborate his work according to the usual canons, that he was a careless or indolent writer. On the contrary, it was his habit to correct his manuscripts with unfailing diligence. He deliberately examined and re-examined each sentence of his journal before admitting it into the essays which he sent to the printer, finding that a certain lapse of time was necessary before he could arrive at a satisfactory decision. His absolute sincerity showed itself as clearly in the style of his writing as in the manner of his life. The one great rule of composition, and if I were a professor of rhetoric I should insist on this, is to speak the truth. This first, this second, this third. In his choice of subjects, it was the common that most often enlisted his sympathy and attention. "The theme," he says, "is nothing. The life is everything. Give me simple, cheap, and homely themes. I omit the unusual, the hurricanes and earthquakes, and describe the common. This has the greatest charm and is the true theme of poetry. Give me the obscure life, the cottage of the poor and humble, the work-days of the world, the barren fields. But while he took these as the subjects for his pen, he so idealized and transformed them by the power of his imagination as to present them in aspects altogether novel and unsuspected, it being his delight to bring to view the latent harmony and beauty of all existent things, and thus indirectly to demonstrate the unity and perfection of nature. Numerous passages might be quoted from Thoreau's works which exhibit these picturesque and suggestive qualities. He had a poet's eye for all forms of beauty, moral and material alike, and for the subtle analogies that exist between the one class and the other. In a word, he was possessed of a most vivid and quickening imagination. His images and metaphors are bold, novel, and impressive, as when, to take but a couple of instances, he alludes to the lost anchors of vessels wrecked off the coast of Cape Cod as the sunken faith and hope of mariners to which they trusted in vain, or describes the autumnal warmth on the sheltered side of Walden as the still glowing embers which the summer, like a departing hunter, had left. And, with all his simplicity and directness of speech, he has an unconscious, almost mystic eloquence which stamps him unmistakably as an inspired writer, a man of true and rare genius, so that it has been well said of him that he lived and died to transfuse external nature into human words. In this respect, his position among prose writers is unique. No one, unless it be Richard Jefferies, can be placed in the same category with him. In so far as he studied the external form of his writings, the aim and object which Thoreau set before him may be summed up in one word: concentration. He avows his delight in sentences which are concentrated and nutty. The distinctive feature of his own literary style could not have been more accurately described. The brief, barbed, epigrammatic sentences which bristle throughout his writings, pungent with shrewd wisdom and humor, are the appropriate expression of his keen, thrifty nature. There is not a superfluous word or syllable, but each passage goes straight to the mark and tells its tale as the work of a man who has some more urgent duty to perform than to adorn his pages with artificial tropes and embellishments. He is fond of surprising and challenging his readers by the piquancy and strangeness of his sayings, and his use of paradox is partly due to the same desire to stimulate and awaken curiosity, partly to his wayward and contradictory nature. The dangers and demerits of a paradoxical style are sufficiently obvious, and no writer has ever been less careful than Thoreau to safeguard himself against misunderstandings on this score. He has consequently been much misunderstood, and will always be so, save where the reader brings to his task a certain amount of sympathy and kindred sense of humor. To those who are not gifted with the same sense of the inner identity which links together many things that are externally unlike, some of Thoreau's thoughts and sayings must necessarily appear to be a fair subject for ridicule. Yet that he should have been charged with possessing no humor would be inexplicable, save for the fact that the definitions of that quality are so various and so vague. Broad wit and mirthful, genial humor he certainly had not, and he confessedly disliked writings in which there is a conscious and deliberate attempt to be amusing. He found Rabelais, for instance, intolerable. It may be sport to him, he says, but it is death to us. A mere humorist, indeed, is a most unhappy man, and his readers are most unhappy also. But though he would not or could not recognize humor as a distinct and independent quality, and even attempted, as we are told, to eliminate what he considered levity from some of his essays, he none the less enjoyed keenly, and himself unmistakably exhibited, the quiet, latent, unobtrusive humor which is one of the wholesome and saving principles of human life. Among Thoreau's own writings, Walden is especially pervaded by this subtle sense of humor, grave, dry, pithy, sententious, and almost saturnine in its tone. Yet perhaps for that very reason the more racy and suggestive to those readers who have the faculty for appreciating it. It has been remarked that it is impossible to classify Thoreau. He cannot be called a man of science, he cannot be called a poet, he cannot even be called a prose poet. Footnote: Athenaeum, October 1882. End footnote. If classification of any kind be desirable in the case of such a Protestant and freelance, he should probably be called an essayist with a strong didactic tendency. He could not, as his friend Channing observes, mosaic his essays, but preferred to give himself free play by throwing them into the narrative and autobiographical form. The Week and Walden, the two volumes which were published in his lifetime, are both framed on this principle, a more or less slight record of personal experience being made the peg on which to hang a great deal of ethical moralizing and speculation. Apart from all question of the value of the opinions advanced, the charm of those books lies mainly in their intellectual alertness, keen spiritual insight, and brilliant touches of picturesque description. Few authors have created such a rich store of terse, fallacious epithets, or have drawn such vivid and sympathetic sketches of natural scenery. Numerous examples of his laconic, incisive utterances have already been incidentally quoted. Here is a characteristic open-air picture of a bright, breezy day on the Concord River, where he spent so much of his time. Many waves are there agitated by the wind, keeping nature fresh, the spray blowing in your face, reeds and rushes waving, ducks by the hundred all uneasy in the surf and the raw wind, just ready to rise, and now going off with a clatter and a whistling like riggers straight for Labrador, flying against the stiff gale with reefed wings, or else circling round first with all their paddles briskly moving just over the surf to reconnoitre you before they leave these parts. Gulls wheeling overhead, muskrats swimming for dear life, wet and cold, with no fire to warm them by that you know of, their labored homes rising here and there like haystacks, and countless mice and moles and winged titmice along the sunny windy shore, cranberries tossed on the waves and heaving up on the beach, their little red skiffs beating about among the alders. Such healthy natural tumult as proves the last day is not yet at hand. And there stand all around the alders and birches and oaks and maples, full of glee and sap, holding in their buds until the waters subside. Here, too, to show the more human side of Thoreau's genius, is one of the picturesque character sketches which are far from uncommon in his writings. I can just remember an old brown-coated man who was the Walden of this stream, who had come over from Newcastle, England, with his son. The latter a stout and hardy man who had lifted an anchor in his day. A straight old man he was, who took his way in silence through the meadows, having passed the period of communication with his fellows, his old experienced coat hanging long and straight and brown as the yellow pine bark, glittering with so much smothered sunlight, if you stood near enough, no work of art, but naturalized at length. I often discovered him unexpectedly amid the pads and the gray willows when he moved, fishing in some old country method, for youth and age then went a-fishing together, full of incommunicable thoughts, perchance about his own Tyne and Northumberland. He was always to be seen in serene afternoons haunting the river, and almost rustling with the sedge. So many sunny hours in an old man's life, and trapping silly fish, almost grown to be the son's familiar. What need had he of hat or raiment any, having served out his time, and seen through such thin disguises? I have seen how his coeval fates rewarded him with the yellow perch, and yet I thought his luck was not in proportion to his years. And I have seen when, with slow steps and weighed down with aged thoughts, he disappeared with his fish under his low-roofed house on the skirts of the village. I think nobody else saw him. Nobody else remembers him now, for he soon after died and migrated to new Tyne streams. His fishing was not a sport, not solely a means of subsistence, but a sort of solemn sacrament and withdrawal from the world, just as the aged read their Bibles. End of Chapter 10, Part 1.